Welcome to Series 2 of the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. In Series 2, we speak to young people about life and their stories. What do these boys and girls think it is to be a good man these days? And if you had a story that you could tell an adult and they'd listen, what would that story be? In these short interviews, we explore these questions and much, much more. I'm Dr Ray Swann and I hope you enjoy Series 2 of Understanding Boys. Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. Today,
Dad, I'm doing the intro today.
Okay.
So welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, someone many listeners probably have heard before, Dr Ray Swann.
Thanks very much, Micah. It's a pleasure to be here on the show that I normally host.
So I got a few questions for you that I came up with myself. So firstly, I'll just ask about the podcast and like why you wanted to start doing the podcast itself.
Well, the idea came a few years ago. I was talking to a guy called Tom Harkin who runs Tomorrow Man, and we were just talking about stories and about men and masculinity and how things were changing. And I guess it was about, working with boys and teenage boys that I've done for a long time, and just about wanting to, I guess, explore what it is to be a good man these days and to hear what people have to say, firstly. And secondly, I think that there is a shift in the kinds of stories that we tell. And, we tell stories now that are really short and, really succinct and, like little bites and grabs like they are on Twitter. And I think the idea of a podcast and actually being able to connect into the common wisdom that might be out there was also really appealing. So I thought, well, this could be really good. And it's been a real pleasure to speak to some people, many of which are people I've admired for a long time, or I've read their books, or I've wanted to speak to, and it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to be able to do that. But that's certainly why it started.
Like, who's it for? Like, primarily, and then like secondarily, I suppose. Yeah,
sure. I think primarily it's about anyone who's interested in masculinities generally, but I think it has a parent focus. Again, with the work that I do in schools and maybe a little bit more broadly, I think. And certainly personally, like no one ever really told me how to be a dad or how to raise a son. In this case, you, which is quite ironic that you're interviewing me. But so please don't make any. Thanks, mate. Don't make any comments on that. But primarily parents. I think we ran where I work. We started running parent workshops a few years ago, and we had a whole bunch of ideas around that. But one of the best parts of it was actually when parents get to talk about some of the things that they find challenging and also some of the things that they find are working. And so in that sense, that's where the podcast has certainly got to.
Right. So overall, your Series 1 of the podcast and all the people you've interviewed, what are a few highlights from the interview itself or interviews?
Yeah, sure. So I think what some of the highlights have been for me personally has been that everybody has just been really willing to get involved and to talk. I think the level of insights I found really amazing. Like I got to speak to some people who are based overseas and hearing what they had to talk about. Like one of the podcasts is a guy called Michael Reichhardt, who's a psychologist who just done a lot of work in boys and relational learning. And I found some of the way that he's just really wise. He just sees some of his conceptualizations about how to parent and what's important and what's not important. That was a real highlight. I think I've always been a big fan of Trevor Hendy, so being able to talk to him, about his work and how he sees things. Judy Chu from Stanford, again, someone whose book I've read and had admired from afar. But really, I think all of the guests that we've had have all brought something really unique to the show.
So what have you learned about yourself throughout this process? Like maybe not even about yourself, but about being a parent or just about being a man that, even in your old age, you could probably have a few, gems of wisdom that you picked up in, since you started.
Yeah, sure. And I think there's probably been a few things. So if I went across it, I think listening to people's stories and how they've been able to deal with really profound changes in their life is something that's really moved me. I think, listening to someone like Liz Dawes, listening to someone like Dawn O'Neill and what she talks about in the sense that, one of the things that she says was, don't worry about all the things you do in your career, just really focus on the work you're trying to do. So I found that really personally motivating because, again, she's led a life of service and someone I really look up to as being a real social agent and a driver of change. I think, the warmth of meeting some people like Tim Costello and Steve Biddulph were really warm and funny and really available. I really liked talking to some of the other people as well, some of the athletes and, and unfortunately some of the best bits actually happened either in the before, we turned post-record and after, where people sort of loosened up a little bit more.
Just like our podcast when I failed this intro about 4 times.
Yeah. But that's also been good. So for me personally, what have I learnt? Well, I've learned that people are really available. People are, happy to talk, that, that nobody really has all the answers, but that people do have, a genuine willingness to share and connect.
Yeah, okay. So just back on that thing about what Liz Dawes said about it's not about the job you do, but the work you do itself. Maybe can you elaborate on that a bit? It sounds like an interesting idea.
Yeah, sure. That was actually Dawn O'Neill. Dawn was talking about focusing on, just focusing on the work, just keep coming back to that and making that, I guess, something to focus on. And I think sometimes in life, particularly in the modern world, we think a bit about, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But actually, when you're really dealing with complex issues and things that are difficult to fix and difficult to change, just remaining committed to the general part of that is really important, I think. And that's really what I got from her. And then, and again, later, I interviewed Damien Bolton late in the series as well, who's a professor of surgery. And we didn't talk about this, but, he set up a foundation that funds like huge amounts of research, into men's health. And again, similar message, just focus on the big things that you're wanting to work on and change. I remember I actually asked him, I said, about being seen. So one of the things that's come up a few times from different guests, and in fact in the series 2, when you hear some of the young people speak about being seen and just how important it is for who we are. But, and I sort of asked that, I tried to turn that question on Damien and said, when have you been seen and when did that feel good? And he sort of said, yeah, look, I won this prize or I did this or I did that. But actually it's some of the other things that have really made, I guess, a bigger impact on him. And lots and lots of the guests have talked about the importance of family. And, that again, just, I guess, in the center of my life, thinking about family and what that means, and for all people, and also people who have difficulties with their families as well. There's so much in that.
What does it mean to be a good man these days? And particularly in the current climate of COVID and everything, it's especially for young men, myself included, it's, year 12 is a challenging year and, but what does it mean to be a good man? Not just what you can achieve, but within yourself and your day-to-day processes that make you a good man.
Yeah, there's so many parts to that. And what I've learned about it through doing the podcast is, Steve Biddulph talks about having backbone and heart. And that's what you sort of want to be and, have someone who's got that sort of strength of knowing who you are, I guess, which is the, the backbone part of it, and that you've got values and beliefs, but then also, you have heart and you have, you're authentic and you have love and compassion and, you have, I guess, a willingness to step into wisdom. I think I was reading a book by Tolstoy, and in it he talks about, his own challenges around mental health, although it wasn't really called mental health when he wrote about it. That's what it was. And he talks about, stepping into life and stepping into those things. And I think that's a really important aspect of being a good man these days. But I think also in working with kids for so many years, I've been working with kids for, quarter of a century or so. and they've taught me so much about what it is, I guess the direction or the trajectory to follow to be a good person, in their hope and aspiration. And I remember a few years ago we had a boy in the school who really liked that that poem about the person in the mirror, the man in the mirror, the one that you see, and that really, with being a good man these days is being authentic and actually aligned, having integrity and being aligned to your real values. And often I think people, think, or what are my values? I don't know what my values are. But then I think, well, maybe that's a good thing to actually work out. Like, work out, what do you stand for? What do you believe in? What's a cause or something that you would die for? And it does sound dramatic. And this takes me back to a really early podcast, which was with James Kerr and the work that he did in observing the All Blacks and that culture of high performance. And they have that thing about purpose, and really what is something that you feel really that you want to step into, to use a Tolstoy expression, step into and live into, and in that sort of faith question, what is something that you believe? And again, Tim Costello said a really similar thing. When you find out what it is that you're here to do, stay close to it, let it follow you, let it be the guide. And as Lunig would say, let it out, let it unravel, let it be the road on which to travel.
So I've got another question. After I was listening to you, I was looking over at the George Orwell Animal Farm on your desk, which I think a few of your students are growing to hate, probably more than love. But what would be a good author for young men to like read their works, and what would be a good book in particular, like one specific book, keeping in mind that we're not all going to read Les Mis or like some other weird Russian thing that you try to suggest to me sometimes?
Yeah, Animal Farm is a great book to read in the sense that it's an allegory, so it's not terribly long, but it's an incredible book in terms of when it appears in the 20th century and the impact that it has on the 20th century, and what George Orwell, I think, sets out by way of thinking, in his critique. And again, George Orwell is a fascinating guy. Went to a really good school and then decided not to go to university. He's in England, and then he goes and fights in another country for another war and comes back and sort of critiques what he can see as the rise of communism and writes a critique in Animal Farm. So I think Animal Farm is definitely, wherever you sit in the political spectrum, is definitely worth looking at in terms of relationships and power and hierarchies and so on. But maybe I could talk about a couple of the books that I loved growing up. And, I don't know how well suited they are these days. But typically I find myself always drawn, back to the classics because they do nominally stand the test of time. I loved as a kid, reading Jack London's Call of the Wild, the story of the dog and the loyalty that he sort of shows. And in a way, how the dog in the story kind of goes from this sort of idyllic, domesticated sense and then gets thrust out into this wild, dangerous place. But then, through his values and his nobility, which I think, it's a great idea by Jack London to tell a story about a dog, because dogs seem so noble and clownish, I guess, in turns. But, and as he sort of goes through that sort of trajectory throughout the novel, I remember as a kid just thinking that was just really superb. And then there's lots of other great books, To Kill a Mockingbird, and looking at, the sense of justice and Atticus Finch, and I think with To Kill a Mockingbird, whenever I've taught it in the past, I always start with the bit where, have you read that?
No, I have not, because I was expecting to study it at one point through my my 12 years at school, but as that's now coming to a close, I might actually read it because school ruins all books. I can't say that on the podcast.
That's a bit harsh, yeah. Possibly true for some though.
Yeah, not for me, obviously, because I'm a good student, but like for some boys, it's not. reading the same chapter 4 times is not fun.
Yeah, and it depends on the outcome, doesn't it? Well, what I was going to say with To Kill a Mockingbird is a book sell on it. Like, so this guy Atticus, he's a lawyer, and the mum's absent in the family, and there's these 2 kids, and there's this kind of mysterious other person in the novel who everyone projects everything on. At the same time, there's a courtroom drama where a man is, really due to racism is accused of doing a terrible crime, and you're seeing it again through the lens of these kids. But there's this awesome bit in it where the dad just steps up to the plate, and you see him in this different light. And I often, when I've taught the book in the past, you ask the kids to read it, but you sort of know, probably half of them haven't even, turned the page. And you may not realise this, mate, but as an English teacher, I can look at your book, I can know if you've read it or not, because there's a certain amount of punishment that a book goes through once it's read.
Yeah, I've read enough books that you haven't failed me. You haven't failed that badly as a father.
Okay.
I've read enough books to know that, like, when the spine's creased enough and the page will sort of be flipping out.
That's right.
And the really, like the top students, they've massacred their book. There's sticky notes and texters, and it looks pretty bad. Like, it would make a person who loves books like horrified. But
that's right.
But they get like A+ on their essays and stuff. So
yeah, and hopefully they get to live into the stories of it, because again, this is one of the podcasts we do at the end of series 1 with Raylene, is that we just keep unpacking just how powerful literacy is, being good at reading, or being interested in reading and interested in things, because it provides you with a whole world that you can live into and have exchange, and without fear of failure. You can really delve into and really change life. It's quite a remarkable thing, the novel. But yeah, I think us English teachers, we do a reasonable job sometimes of killing it. And look, I could go on with other books, but I won't.
I think we were talking about this the other day a bit. If a part of it is stories and stuff, like shock horror, Dr. Swann talks to his son about stories, but we were sort of saying how, like, it's usually the simple stories that make the most sense, and it's because they're very relatable to us, and we can sort of relate with the characters and put our experiences with them if it's relatively simple, and it makes sense in that world. But also that, it's sort of like they make the mistakes and then you learn from their mistakes. So it's like that whole process of, learning from your mistakes without actually suffering the consequences in a way. Like, I think that's something that I've really got out of reading.
Yeah, definitely. That's so true. And, it's interesting as well, the depth of understanding that people really have. Like, one of the projects I'm working on at the moment for this positive masculinity is trying to identify what are a set of key stories that, say if you were 8 or 9 years old, that if you heard them, you could really, I guess, expand what it means to be male, and so that you're not sort of trapped in a man box of, the traditional sort of stereotypical ways.
Plays footy and drinks beer.
Yeah. And one of the stories that we tell the kids it's a retelling of a Hans Christian Andersen story, which is called The Little Matchstick Girl. And it's a beautiful story. It's so poignant and so sad. And basically the moral of the story, or the idea around it, is that, being innerly warm versus innerly cold, or whatever. Anyway, the girl, she's selling matchsticks, and she ends up, out on the snow, and then she kind of, the way the story arc works is, that she's going to run out of matches, and she's going to die. And it's about how those inner things kind of die off in us. But my colleague that I was teaching with, we sort of went through the story process, and then we did what's known as a meta mindfulness, which is about loving kindness. So the boys are, doing this practice of loving kindness, and that helps to engender within themselves that compassion and softness, really. And, it was almost like a throwaway. She sort of said to the boys, these are 8-year-old guys, She said to them, do you think she made the right decision by staying out in the cold? Or should she have gone home? Because the story set up as go home and be cold on the inside, or stay out and be warm on the inside. And it's not spelt out as literally as that.
Yeah,
one of the boys,
story.
Yeah, one of the boys said she made the right decision because she decided to live with a warm heart. And I just, wow, what an insight, from an 8-year-old. It's incredible.
Yeah, little people are, they sometimes have surprising insights. I suppose it comes back to that thing we were speaking about before with like, it's about your work you do, not just your title and everything like that. You know, because on the inside, it's what matters, and not just what the outside world thinks of you, e.g. frozen in the snow. Your outside environment, it's more about, you know, how you feel on the inside. A lot of the time, like obviously they contribute to each other, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that, you know, one of the other things I guess that I've come to learn in my life, you know, going back to your question about being a good man, is that I think that there is the, you know, the unit, if you can imagine a threshold being like your inside and your outside. So the outside of, you know, the universe and everything you see, but then the inside and the, you know, the inner workings and your emotions and your, you know, and it's been said that that inner world is as big as the outside world actually. Like it's vast, and you know there's so much to know and to be present to. And you know I think that these stories sitting within us sometimes, I do wonder whether or not, you know, a lot of these stories are kind of already there, you know, and when we hear them, and the reason we like them is to go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, oh yeah, that's there's something true about it. You know, you can hear a story maybe factually. You know, maybe factually it's not necessarily true.
You can't fly. You can't make wings out of wax and fly close to the sun. But if you get too arrogant, you're definitely going to come hurtling down to the sea, metaphorically, obviously. Yeah, and then
there's a knowing that we kind of get that, even though we may not have even had that experience ourselves. You kind of know that being inflated, being too much in the ego, you know, you're going to go down like hot air balloon. Like you say, hot air balloon, everyone goes, yeah, I get that. You may not have ever done it yourself, but it's there somewhere.
It's almost like intrinsic to being, you know, a human, and like having that connection. It's like, you know, how do birds know to go south in the winter?
There's a great poem by A.D. Hope, The Death of the Bird, where the bird is, you know, flying, and then all of a sudden it sort of loses itself in the poet. The poet describes it as the waking, you know, the waking instinct dies within it, and the earth receiving with its vast design, the tiny burden of its death.
If you could tell a story to a 14-year-old and he'd listen, what would that story be?
Yeah, I think this is such a hard question, and you know, I think it's been really interesting to me to you know, to have all the guests answer it. And I guess when I think about the question, I was reminded firstly I was thinking, well, what are the biggest stories that I've thought about for myself? And when I was a kid, I remember I was in grade prep and we watched this show, and on the show was a story of these two giants, and there was a village, and the two giants were, all the villagers were really terrified of them, but the giants in themselves weren't actually bad people or bad giants, bad tall people.
Like 7 foot tall and super intimidating.
Yeah, they were just really intimidating to others. And anyway, so the giants sort of hatched this plan that one of the giants would sort of go to attack or mock attack the village, and the other giant would actually save the village, and at least one of them would be loved. And so that's what they did. And then one of them is loved, and one of them is makes the sacrifice for the connection for the other one. And I don't know if it's the story that I would tell a 14-year-old that they would listen, but I guess what I would say is that in my own life, that story actually had a really big effect on me, and not necessarily in a good way. And I think that what I came to realize over my life, that actually some of the stories that I was either consciously or unconsciously living into didn't always help me. So I guess my word around the story, or the story for 14-year-olds, would be to think about the kinds of stories that you're listening to, taking what kinds of advice in, because they do start to drive you, and they will start to, I think, inform your destiny. I think it was Heraclitus who said, you know, your character is your destiny. The who you are is the who you're becoming. And, you know, I think we've got to be pretty conscious about some of these things that we're doing and where we're headed, because they have outcomes.
And that's like also the stories that you tell yourself about, like social media and YouTube and Netflix and all that other stuff, all that other media that you can consume. They're all different stories of just in a different format. Like you see that, the 6'4" guy, blonde hair, blue eyes, washboard abs sort of, and you're like, oh, why can't I be like that? And that's him on Instagram on his, is that what you're sort of implying as well, part of it, about like careful what you take in? Because if that's what you think a normal person looks like, sure, there might be someone who looks like that, but the majority of the population is, and that guy is in proper lighting and he has all the filters and the Photoshop and stuff, and it's not actually a true representation, and perhaps that's part of it.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a few things. I think that's one of them. And I think another one is, the story of the two dogs, and there's two dogs having a fight and which one's going to win. One of them's the loyal one and, loving and kind. The other one's sort of a bit rabid and
the yin and
mental.
yang sort of.
Yeah, the yin yang, the dog's
one you feed.
Yeah, it's the one you feed. And I just think, with a lot of the stuff that people take in, and it's massive generalization, but I just think, we're really good with diet now. Like everyone gets it. Oh, if you eat really poor food, you're probably not going to, you might sort of function okay, but we sort of get that, if you eat crappy food, you're going to end up unhealthy.
Who's someone you have met, not necessarily related to the podcast, or maybe not even met, like someone who you've heard about, read about, other than like someone who teenage boys could relate to or, find out about, I don't know, through Facebook or whatever you use. But like someone you look up to, perhaps an icon or whether they're a celebrity or perhaps not even someone specific, maybe just an action someone did.
I think that's a really great question. I think I'm always really moved when I see people, acting with the courage of their convictions. And, I think more recently, I think looking at someone like LeBron James, who's actually deciding to, really speak out for things that he believes in.
What's your advice in terms of like just some basic things for year 12s? Like they're sort of like if you could have like a Ray Swann's top 5 tips for year 12 sort of thing, and perhaps some stuff that you've learnt with me over this year. It's almost over. It's not quite, but home stretch.
Yeah. I guess in simple terms, year 12 is a test. It's a cultural test as much as an academic test, and it puts you in the position of having to do a lot of things you don't really want to do for just about everybody. It's not terribly fair in the sense that it's not necessarily a measure of your intelligence, but it is based around equity principles as much as it can be, in the sense that an exam is about letting anybody have a go. It sort of has that general thing. And so I guess the first thing I would say is if you're wanting to do well in year 12, start early, start in early secondary, in the sense of getting your habits right. Because one of the things that a colleague once said about, chopping the pile of wood, like you can get to year 12 and there's a big pile of wood to chop. You could probably chop it, but you're going to get all sorts of blisters. Whereas if you kind of got hard hands and you're used to getting ready, you're going to find it a lot easier. And it's small because it's about increments. There's enough stressing you out anyway. So if you just got little steps up in some of the things, that can really help. I guess the second thing I would say is, all the stuff around health is right. Sleep and hydration and food and exercise and all those things are really important. And it doesn't mean you got to be, unbelievably healthy, but I just think it makes it a bit easier if you are. The third thing I would say is that, as much as it is, culturally and academically, a transition and a rite of passage of sorts, not everything really rests on it, and certainly a lot of people, they don't necessarily have the academic maturity yet. And I mean, I was like that. Like I wasn't, certainly at school, I wasn't, an academic high achiever. It wasn't until years later that I started to kind of get my head around it, and it took me a long time. And, I said earlier, it's not always fair. And I think a lot of kids I know really, really, smart, and you've got an incredible amount to offer. And I think sometimes school, they get the message that maybe, maybe they walk away with a couple of wounds that they're not intelligent or they're not this or they're not that. And it's really not true. And I think as much as you can, having that broader picture, is really worthwhile, because I remember when I was in year 12, very sadly, a friend of mine decided to, on the day of the results came out, to take his own life. And he had put so much, so much at stake on it. And it was just so devastating, because I don't think it really, well, I knew it didn't matter as much as him, as much as how much he was loved and how much he was cared for. And, there was just a big disconnect in that space, and that should never happen, and that should never have happened.
Perhaps branching off on that a bit, to the parents of those kids, not necessarily just those kids, but kids in general, in year 12, some tips for parents and things you've learned perhaps, or you've heard and that have worked. And obviously every student's different and every child is different, so no one's ever going to have, and every parent's different. But is there some sort of broad sort of approach that you can have that is, and maybe that starts, very early on with, forming a really good relationship and trying to have those conversations about stuff that doesn't even really matter. So when the big questions come up, they'll feel comfortable to talk to you about those big questions.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Absolutely. And that is, build the relationship really strongly. Actually, you know what? The best advice I've heard in a long time, a friend of mine told me recently, and that is the 3 W's as a parent. And that is, ask what needs to happen. So if you're having a conversation with your child about year 12, what do you need to do? When does it need to happen by? And then after that, the 3rd W is walk away. That's all you need to do, because otherwise, because actually what parents I think forget a lot is that 99 times out of 100, the person you're talking to knows exactly what to do. They know exactly why. They know exactly what needs to happen. They know who to ask if they're not stuck. They know everything. It's just that there's a block around it. And actually what they need to deal with the block is just your love and support and your kindness. And often parents go the other way and they go hard, or they go, they make threats, or they make ultimatums, or they make these things. And that only makes the block, sometimes it can move the block a little bit in the short term, but I think ultimately it doesn't really help as much. That's my experience.
My advice is definitely that walk away one is big, because it's they're going to do it or they're not going to do it, and it's just whether they have your help doing it or not. That's the big difference. And maybe if you're really nice to them, they'll be like, oh, I better go do it then, because, mum or dad's been really nice to me. Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it?
Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been a great conversation. You got any homework to do?
I'm in year 12, there's always homework to do. That's just another thing.
All right, so now I get to walk away. We hope you've enjoyed this Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app, and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.